All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Turf Republic Turf Chat Hangout. And today we've got a very special guest with us. We have Dr. Daniel Peck. He's a lead scientist and owner of Grass Systems Entomology. And we wanted to have Dr. Peck on. Recently, he held an event, European Crane Fly Biology and Management in Bar Harbor, Maine. This event was sponsored by Syngenta. And Dr. Peck went through, talked to some superintendents and lawn care managers on basically the new European crane fly, I won't call them outbreaks, but situations we're seeing up in the Northeast. He wanted to talk to this group on what he is seeing based on some research that was done out in the Northwest, really how to handle these crane flies, and get some feedback from them in terms of what they're seeing. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the crowd. We have some people joining us today. Let them introduce themselves, and then we'll go from there. Andrew?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Hardy. I'm golf course superintendent at Pheasant Run Golf Club in Sharon, Ontario, Canada. Glad to be here this afternoon.
All right. Dr. Peck?
Hi, I'm happy to be here this afternoon too. You've got my name. I'm lead scientist at Grass Systems Entomology. I've worked the last couple of years as an independent consultant in the area of plant protection, working with clients to help resolve their problems with turf infesting grass feeding and soil dwelling insect pests. Before that, I was an assistant professor at Cornell University, and I was in charge of the research and extension program in the area of turfgrass entomology and soil insect ecology. And prior to that, I spent 7 years at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture in Cali, Colombia, in South America, where I also worked on some other grass pests, namely in sugarcane and in tropical forage grasses. It's good to be here.
Very good. And Lindsay and Grace?
Hi, I'm Lindsay Noonan. I work with Gibson Sale Business Communications. We work very closely with Syngenta down in North Carolina, and thanks to Bill and Dr. Peck and others for their support of this event and this Google Hangout.
All right, very good. Oh, might have lost Andrew there. All right, so Dr. Peck, let's start off. You had this event, and there was a reason you had the event. Is European crane flies were more prominent in the Northwest, and you're starting to see them come in the Northeast. So if you could kind of give us a little history on European crane fly, and then what you're seeing in terms of their arrival in the Northeast.
Yeah, one of the reasons we chose Bar Harbor in coastal Maine and also Plymouth in Cape Cod area, Massachusetts, is that these are the areas where these insects have emerged and are established most recently, and so they've become a big headache for turfgrass managers since 2009 and 2010 in those areas. But the crane fly is relatively new in the Northeast. The first detection in the Northeast United States was in 2004, both species in western New York. And since then, we've been tracking their spread across New York. And they're certainly not everywhere yet across the Northeast. But we know of them in certain states now, and their range is slowly spreading. If you could put up slide number 8, it gives us an idea of where crane flies have been detected in the northeastern parts of the United States. First in New York, then later we've been seeing them in Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Ohio, as well as Massachusetts and Maine. Those are other areas where we've seen them. Bill, are you able to put up that slide number 8 for us?
Yes.
There we go.
Yep.
Here you can see that one thing to keep in mind is that we're not just dealing with one insect, we're dealing with 2 insects, Tipula pallidosa, known as the European crane fly, and Tipula oleracea, known as the common or marsh crane fly. They're both of European origin. And here you can see their current known distribution at the level of state in the Northeast. But they've established earlier, and Bill, if you would bring up slide number 7, they've established prior in North America before, in Canada and particularly in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. So largely crane flies have established in 3 geographic areas of North America. We're talking the eastern Canadian Maritimes down into Quebec and Maine. We're talking the Pacific Northwest, which includes British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. And then we've got them in the eastern Great Lakes, which includes the southern end of Ontario, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York State, as well as into Massachusetts. Bill, are you able to pull up that slide?
Yes, it's on. It's on, Daniel.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see it.
That's
there.
okay.
So I was talking off my head. But these are largely the three geographic areas. Now, if you were to pull up the final slide about geographic distribution, slide number 9, you can see from our work in New York State over the years that we have documented that crane flies have moved across the state. They were first documented in western New York in 2004, and then a separate establishment in 2006, and then finally in 2012 we detected them in that green spot in Albany County, largely meaning that this one species, Oleracea, is probably pretty widespread throughout the state right now. But one important point to make is that crane flies are not everywhere yet. They're certainly not everywhere in the northeastern United States. They're not even everywhere in New York State. And secondly is that we're dealing with two species. One species is much less dispersive, and that's Tipula pallidosa. The other species is much more dispersive, and that's Tipula oleracea, and that's reflected in the range that we currently see them to know them to be established. So what happened in Bar Harbor in 2009 was an outbreak of Tipula pallidosa, which was unexpected, and what happened in 2000, I believe, 8 in Massachusetts in the Cape Cod area is an unexpected outbreak of Tipula oleracea. So both of these areas are now experiencing one of the two crane fly species. So we thought it was important to bring our best understanding to Bar Harbor, Maine, and also to Plymouth, Massachusetts, so we could spread the good word about this new invasive pest.
Very good. So one of the other things you talked about was kind of identifying whether you have them or not, and then we'll get into control. So because they're just so sporadic in these areas, I'll pull the map back up of New York, and even the other map you showed. We had some superintendents reach out on Twitter today that wanted to attend but couldn't, that are up in the New York area. So what should they be looking for? I'll talk from a disease standpoint. There's been some diseases in the last couple of years that, the minute they're mentioned, everybody seems like they have them. So what are some things that superintendents, turf managers, lawn care managers can do to begin to identify these?
Well, I'll preface my answer by saying that one of the dilemma with a new invasive pest like this is that we have relatively little experience managing it in the Northeast. Prior to this, none of our native crane fly species have ever been problematic. There may be 500 to 600 native species of crane flies in New York State. The only two that cause any type of injury that we know of to turf grass are Tipula pallidosa and Tipula oleracea. So first of all, this represents an entire new insect pest that we're not aware of, and so it may go undetected for a while until it reaches outbreak levels, and then a turfgrass manager is already dealing with populations that are out of control. So some of the things you want to look for is, one of the features of its life cycle that I most enjoy is the fact that after it pupates down in the soil level, that pupa wriggles up to the surface, and it comes halfway out. Maybe you could put up slide number 3 while I'm talking about this. And that pupa then wriggles out of the soil, comes halfway out of the ground, and that slide you're seeing is of a putting green, and it leaves behind, you can move to the next slide, slide number 4, a pupil case. And that pupil case is what's called a leather jacket, which is why the immatures or the larvae of this insect are often called leather jackets. It leaves behind that pupil case. And that's a part of the life cycle that you can scout really well if you're dealing with low-mown turf like a golf course superintendent is. You can put your head down, take a look at the profile of that nice low-cut turf, and what you see is that twig-like pupil exuvia sticking up, and you can identify it. When you see many of these, or a lot of forests of these pupil cases, that's an indication that you probably have the invasive crane fly. At that point, you should go out and try to find adults of the crane fly, because you need to be able to distinguish this one from the native insects. We have literally dozens or tens to dozens of insects that are crane flies that grow up in grassy areas, and we can't indict these in damage. So you need to get to that adult stage so we can definitively identify it as Tupula pallidosa or Tupula oleracea. Now, the time of year to scout for those pupil cases or to scout for the flocks of giant mosquitoes, which what crane flies look like, there's two windows of time. One time is in the fall when both species emerge as adults, and that will happen in August and into September. You'll have the adults emerge, and you'll see them to be like giant mosquitoes. You could put up slide number 1 if you don't mind, Bill, and we can see a picture of one of the adults. The public will know them to be like giant mosquitoes. They're about 1 inch long. They certainly don't transmit diseases. They certainly don't suck blood. But when they emerge en masse in the backs of people's home lawns, especially homeowners, might get concerned about that and not recognize them until they've been in the area for a couple years. You need to collect those adults and submit them to a specialist for identification to make sure that you're actually dealing with one of the invasives or one of the noxious crane flies. You're welcome to send them to me. I always say that I'm the happiest person in the eastern United States to take a look at your crane flies and identify if you're dealing with one of the invasive species. So send them my way free of charge. So in the fall, in September, approximately 2 weeks in September is when Tupula pallidosa adults like to emerge at any one site. Oleracea adults emerge in a much less synchronous fashion from even late July through August and into September. Now, the other window of time when these adults emerge, and you might find the pupil cases or the adults, is in spring. Oleracea has 2 generations a year, unlike pallidosa that has 1 generation a year. If you could put up slide number 5, we can see that in a little more detail. So in the spring is another window of time when oleracea adults are flying. This would be the first couple weeks in May or the last couple weeks in April. It's another window of time when you can scout for the adult stage. Now beyond that, of course, are scouting for the signs of damage and also signs of the larvae. I already showed you a picture of the larvae, but slide number 2 shows you the different instars, or the different developmental stages of the larvae and their approximate size. When they get as big as they're going to get, they're almost 1 inch long. As small as they're going to get, they're only 1 millimeter or so long. That first little dot next to the penny is actually one of the eggs that you will have trouble seeing. So recognizing their damage is one way that you can detect them early. Slide number 10, Bill, if you will, shows some of the classic damage that you might see on a infested home lawn. This is an example of extreme thinning damage where the larva feeds above ground and pulls down the new stem and feeds on it. The larvae will also feed underground on the roots, just like a white grub will. If you show us slide number 11, the next slide.
Daniel, real quick, I don't mean to, looking at this picture specifically, the bottom left one, there seems to be 2 patches towards middle left that seem to be untouched. Are this, is this turf species specific? They like one more than another?
That's a good question. As far as we know so far, crane flies will feed on any type of grass grown in a turf grass environment and other type of grasses as well. So they're more restricted by having humid enough conditions at the time when they lay their eggs. Those eggs are really susceptible to drying out, so they need moist conditions when those eggs are around. So that's one of the more important things regarding where they're going to be in their habitat. But what you see broader in that picture is that on the left side of that lower picture is where the lawn care practitioner clearly protected against crane flies, but then missed that whole spot. Because if you go to the next slide, slide number 11, you can see clearly what the difference is between protected and unprotected turf at a time when there was an outbreak of crane flies. This was an instance with pallidosa in April or May, when the insect is growing as fast as it's going to grow and is getting as big as it's going to get and is eating as voraciously as possible. This is where you'll start to see damage, and you might recognize this as something that you're unfamiliar seeing at this time of year. So this is another way to detect it. And then a couple other damaged flies. If you take a look at number 12, here's what damage looks like from oleracea on a golf course putting green. And to the likes of it, this looks just like black cutworm damage. If you're a golf course superintendent experienced in the Northeast, you'll see that type of scalping or chewing damage around the hole. But in this instance, it's not black cutworm. This is an instance of Tipula oleracea larvae that have set up shop in aerification holes and are using them as protection, and meanwhile coming out at night and feeding on the ground. And another obvious way that you'll see them is when you see pile-ups of maggots like this. This is a pile of maggots that have been washed off the surface of the ground where the insects were feeding on the surface. The insects will also die on the surface after fast-acting insecticides like carbaryl or pyrethroids will cause them to come to the surface and die, where you might see big pile-ups of maggots like that. So there's a lot of ways. You recognize the pupil exuviae, you recognize the adults and submit those for identification. You can detect the larvae, and you can certainly detect their damage. Those are ways that you might be able to identify these. And the best chances you'll have is if you think about the crane fly life cycle and are familiar when the different stages of the life stages are out there, so you can go in and scout at the right time of the year.
Okay. Well, Andrew, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add in. I have a couple more questions, or.
Well, I guess I'm assuming that you're going to move into controls here at some point.
Yes.
And I know I don't know how familiar you are with our pesticide law in the province of Ontario here, but we lawn care operators have no access to synthetic pesticides. There was a pesticide ban brought into place in 2009, and golf courses, though we are exempt from the ban right now, our choices of products, certainly we don't have the arsenal that you have down in the U.S. And I'm just wondering, are there biological controls or natural controls for the crane fly?
Well, that's a good question, Andrew. We are pretty limited. The only real cultural technique that you can use is to hone in at that point in their life cycle when those eggs and the first instar larvae, the early stage larvae, are susceptible to drying out. If you have an irrigated home lawn, for instance, when you see the eruption of the adults, at that point you should withhold moisture or irrigation as much as you can, because that will set them back. A crane fly egg will probably dry up and desiccate if it goes more than a few hours without contact with moisture. Also, those early stage larvae are also pretty susceptible to the top layer of the soil drying out. So that way you can think of an irrigated home lawn as being a very susceptible and very favorable habitat for crane flies. At that time of the year, when you see the adults emerging and starting to lay eggs, if you can withhold moisture, limit your irrigation, and keep conditions as dry as possible, that's one way that you could set back that population. Certainly under natural conditions, if we have a naturally dry fall in September, or naturally dry spell in May, those things will set back the crane fly populations a lot and really reduce the chances of outbreaks. Besides classical insecticides, there are a few other alternatives that are known to be effective against crane flies. I know Pam Charbonneau with the Ontario Turfgrass Institute, she continues to do work with entomopathogenic nematodes to see what role that they might have in suppressing crane fly populations, especially in Canada, where your controls are really limited. But here in the Northeast United States, there's really no other products that we can recommend besides insecticidal controls.
So, Dr. Peck, one of the things, when I was a superintendent in my area, annual bluegrass weevil really hit us pretty hard in the early 2000s. I had gone from a golf course that was older push-up greens, predominantly POA, to a golf course that was built in 2001, all bent grass, California greens. And we had some weevil damage in the roughs, some of the higher trafficked areas on the fairways that had POA come in, but it was, you know, we're just going to leave it alone because it's a biological POA control. Well, one summer we came in and we were starting to have, it was tees that were up on a hill along the woods. We started seeing bent grass decline, and I thought it was root pythium at the time. It was a little bit wetter, symptoms of root decline, and I had somebody come out and ended up being annual bluegrass weevil eating the bent grass. So I'm leading into, you talked about chemical intervention and if intervention is even needed. Is that specifically on a threshold level? And I bring up the ABW because with the ABW, if you allow your populations to get high enough, they're just going to eat what's there regardless of turf species. So in terms of intervening with these, when should you consider doing it?
There's a couple windows of time when you need to hone in. First of all, if you see damage in May, you're not aware that crane fly has been in your neck of the woods, and suddenly you're seeing the damage that I already explained. Then you're going to have to reach for something which is not going to give you 100% control. It'll give you 50 to 60% control, and a lot of our fast-acting curative insecticides will help you out at that point. If, however, you know that you have a crane fly issue, you can scout for the crane flies earlier in April when they're third instar. They're still big enough to be able to scout, and you can work off thresholds to decide if you're going to have problems later once they start to transition to the fourth instar. The trouble is our thresholds are really broad, maybe 15 to 40 insects or larvae per square foot is what a turf grass can handle. So if you have a good stand, well fertilized, growing well, you can withstand maybe up to 40 crane flies a square foot before you suffer visible damage or inordinate damage. But in less thrifty stands of turf, you may have only 15 a square foot and you could suffer damage. So there's a very broad threshold. So one way you can approach their control is to scout for them in early April. I'm talking Palidosa now, the one which is active in the spring. You can scout for them in early April, assess your thresholds, and then decide to intervene. Or you can wait until you have a problem express itself in early May, and then decide to intervene at that point. With Palidosa, the other window when you might want to intervene is in the fall, which would be more like a preventive window. At that point in the fall, crane flies have erupted as adults, they've laid their eggs, and they're young larvae and fairly susceptible larvae as they feed all the way into November. At that point in time, you can't assess thresholds because it's very hard to dig and scout for crane flies because they're quite small and camouflaged, so they're hard to pick out of the soil. But you can go in and decide to put in a preventive because you've seen so many adults or because you're in a high-risk situation where you can't afford to be wrong. And at that point, you can put down a preventive insecticide. We have a lot of insecticides that will give 70 to 80 to 90% control at that time in their life cycle. One of the reasons to think about a spring control is that a lot of those crane flies in the fall will die over winter, and in the spring you can actually assess thresholds and then decide whether you need to intervene or not. Alternatively, if you're risk adverse, you would control them in the fall and get pretty good control. In the fall, one of the key points with using insecticides to remember is that if you're using a contact insecticide, you need to wait at least 4 weeks after you see the adult flights because they need to lay their eggs, those eggs need to hatch, and then those larvae need to be susceptible if you put down something like a pyrethroid or carbaryl or some other fast-acting insecticide. You have to make sure you're not attacking the egg stage. You've actually waited long enough to attack the young larval stage. But other chemistries that are possible in the fall are acelepryn and imidacloprid. These are some preventive insecticides that you can put down before you see the eruption of adults or even at the time you see the eruption of the adults. Acelepryn is an interesting chemistry in that you can put it down if you see the eruption of the adults and it will prevent problems the rest of the year. You can also use it against grubs in the spring, and if you use it as a later grub application in the spring, say in May, it is possible that that application, that single application in May to control grubs, will be there long enough to control any crane flies that hatch in September and October. So acelepryn, among the softer insecticides, long residual insecticides, has a real role for helping to pick off crane flies at the same time you're trying to use it to target other insects like caterpillars or white grubs or some of these other widespread turfgrass insect pests. Very
good. So one of the other things you had talked about in your seminar was the misconception of the European crane fly. I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit as well.
Yeah, the misconception is really some of the things it takes us a long time to learn, and I've touched on all three of those. I would say 3 points. One is to remember that not one but two species are invasive. They do things differently enough that you need to be aware and diagnose which of the two species that you have, because you just take a look at their life cycle. One has 2 generations a year, the other has a single generation a year, and when you time to go in and scout or monitor, or when you go in to time your insecticide applications, definitely depends on which of the 2 species you have. Also, Palidosa is bound to be more problematic because it is less dispersive, and it's going to grow up in the areas, the eggs are going to be laid in the same areas where the larvae grew up, because the adults are not very dispersive at all when they're full of eggs. Oleracea, on the other hand, will move around a lot more on its own volition, because it'll lay eggs over a longer period of time, and the adult females are much more dispersive, or able to fly when they're full of eggs. So you need to realize that there's 2 species, not just one, that we're dealing with. Secondly, is to realize that crane flies are not yet everywhere. It's likely that, and especially in the case of Palidosa, that it's moving around in infested soil media, such as infested sod or potted plants, or other ways that it's getting around. You take a look at, we looked at its geographic establishment. It's clearly not an insect that is all over the state now. It's still emerging and it's still establishing in new areas. So one of the worst things we could do is move infested sod, infested with crane fly, to an area where crane fly is not yet established, especially in the case of Palidosa. And then finally, the other important thing, which I hope people get out of these seminars and talks like this, is to remember that we can only indict 2 of the many diverse species that are crane flies. These 2 are recently established in the Northeast, Tipula palidosa and Tipula oleracea. All the other numerous crane fly lookalikes out there are not problems. So now that you are aware of crane flies being an issue, that these are new pests that we need to contend with, make sure you nail the culprit and identify the correct species, so that you don't go out and intervene or get all worried about native species, which can occur out there in the grasses as well. So those are the 3 points that I would say. One, that there are 2 crane fly species, not 1. Second, that they're not everywhere yet, but they are moving and they're coming to a neighborhood near you. And third, that there are a whole host of native species out there that we have to make sure we distinguish these 2 pestiferous species from.
All right, very good. Andrew, do you have anything else you'd like to ask or add? Or
it's becoming quite apparent for us that there are crane fly here. I just don't know how. Like, my in-laws have more at their house 2 hours north of Toronto than we have 40 minutes north of Toronto. So between the white grub, the crane fly, and a pesticide ban, you won't need to have grass anymore. That's exactly where we're heading.
Yeah.
Outside of a golf course where, for now, we have products available. I'm sure that'll change one day too.
Yeah. And Dr. Peck, you talked about some cultural controls in terms of trying to keep that surface as dry as you can in certain times of the year, allow those eggs to dry out. By me and Andrew, I don't know if it's the same by you, but you drive by a convenience store or a corner gas station, and they've got it's raining out, and they've got the irrigation systems running and running and running and running, and that's certainly not helping the situation. Obviously, nobody's monitoring, but it goes back to with you guys in Canada having no synthetic controls. It's tough to. You're right. You're not going to have any grass soon.
And then you throw in the wettest October in the last 25 years, and I can remember my kids ripping around at my in-laws on a 4-wheeler this fall, and you had to keep your mouth closed, because like the mass of crane fly, it would be a great test plot for you.
Oh.
Wow.
We're always looking for a good test plot, but it reminds you that when you have a new invasive insect, you think about some of the other ones we've had contend with, the emerald ash borer and the Asian longhorn beetle. These things are game changers, and we don't work with big trees like those other pests attack, but we work with turf grass settings, and crane flies, once they establish, are a game changer. That's for sure.
Yeah. So Dr. Peck, along with Syngenta, held their first workshop in Bar Harbor, Maine on the 7th of November. And you have another one coming up, correct, on the 21st and 22nd in Plymouth, Massachusetts.
Yes, we do. It's actually the 20th and the 21st in Plymouth, Massachusetts, to get out to the guys near Cape Cod.
Very good. So anybody wants to join, we have some links on our site that you can register for this event. Anything else you'd like to add about the event in terms for people attending?
Yeah, please come and sign up. It's a 4-hour workshop, so you're not going to get any better information on the planet on invasive crane flies than you'll get at this workshop. We'll have a chance to see specimens, a chance to talk about them from all angles, and a chance to hear your concerns about how we might be able to work together to minimize their impact in golf course situations.
All right, very good. Well, everybody, thanks for joining us for this short turf chat on European crane fly. Andrew, thanks for joining us. Dr. Peck, for your contribution. Lindsay and Grace, thanks for being with us. Actually, Lindsay and Grace, do you have anything you'd like to add to this at all, or before we close it out?
I think we're good, Bill. I think it was great information.
All right, very good. So check out the website. We've got some links to register. November 20 and 21, 4-hour workshop with Dr. Peck on European crane fly. Sponsored by Syngenta. We'll have this video on demand for you, so you feel free to check it out, and also some photo galleries of the event as well. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Everybody have a good weekend.